Welcome to Budget EDH. Today we're going to be looking at Mazzy, Truesword Paladin. Mazzy is a Naya commander, and we're going to give it a budget of $1. Now that seems really high for a green deck. It's going to make sense when we show you the linchpin of the deck. So Mazzy is actually an enchantments commander, mostly actually an aura commander, and a little bit of goading here as well. Mazzy herself encourages you to recast auras that go to the graveyard, and because we're auraing around so much, we cast so many auras. This is a bit of a Bogle commander as well. We don't have that many ways of protecting our Bogle, but we can recycle the enchantments thanks to Mazzy's second ability. Whenever an aura you control is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, exile it. Until the end of your next turn, you may cast that card. And it also has the first ability. Whenever an enchanted creature attacks one of your opponents, it gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. So the second ability is going to let us recast our enchantments, specifically only auras that go to the graveyard from the battlefield. Now this ability will let us recast our enchantments that mostly just sacrifice themselves. We don't actually want our creatures to die and then the aura goes to graveyard and then it gets exiled. All right, we actually just want the enchantment to blow itself up somehow, or we blow it up, and then we get to cast it again, either this turn or the next turn. Now the first ability is mostly just gravy. It's going to help us attack through our opponents. We don't really have to worry about trample. Mazzy very quickly just becomes a 5/4 with any random garbage enchantment. And then also it helps our opponents because sometimes we're going to go to our opponents with our enchantments, and then their creatures will have +2/+0 and trample whenever they attack a player who is not us. So immediately we're going to showcase our $1 card. This is Enchantress Presence. This card is absolutely bananas in any sort of enchantment deck. It's basically required because to actually feel like an Enchantress deck. Otherwise, you're just playing a normal deck with very cheap and efficient enchantments. Next, we have our blow up sacrifice auras. So these two auras have the ability draw a card. With Capacious Standard, it's a little bit worse, but it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1, and then you pay 2 mana to sack it and draw a card. So the full loop costs 3 mana. Unbridled Growth is a million times better, specifically 3 times better. You pay 1 green, you enchant a land, and then you sacrifice Unbridled Growth to draw a card. So this whole loop only costs 1 mana, and then it's gonna draw you 1 card for 1 mana. Next, we have a couple more enchantment-based card draw. Snake Umbra is a totem armor. Specifically, this is actually a great synergy with Mazzy because the totem armor is going to blow itself up whenever the creature is destroyed or dealt lethal damage. Instead, you're just going to destroy the Snake Umbra. And the Snake Umbra also gives the creature the ability, whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Tenuous Truth is another aura. It will blow itself up, but hopefully, if your opponents constantly blow it up, you just don't bother casting it again unless you have Enchantress Presence. So it has the ability Enchanted Goading, and then at the beginning of enchanting the opponent's end step, you and that player each draw a card, and then you basically both can't attack each other unless you want to blow up the Tenuous Truth. Tempered in Solitude is a 2-mana enchantment, and it says whenever a creature you control attacks alone, exile a top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So ideally, you just exile a land and then you play it so that you don't have to play a land from your own hand. Or if it's just a non-land card, just cast it immediately. Tempered in Solitude is going to work pretty well with our deck because we're basically a Bogle deck. We're not going to actually attack with that more than just one creature because we don't actually have that many creatures, and we kind of want to leave the rest for blocking. Next, we have 3 Ordeals. These Ordeals are pretty important because they're going to put +1/+1 counters on your creature. This is kind of a permanent effect. It doesn't require the aura to stick around. And then when you sacrifice the Ordeal, you're going to get a bonus. Ordeal of Nylea being the best bonus, getting you 2 basic lands, putting them onto battlefield tapped. Ordeal of Purphoros is going to do 3 damage to any target. And then Ordeal of Heliod is going to gain you 10 life. So if you somehow get all 3 Ordeals on the same creature, they're all gonna put +1/+1 counters. Now, admittedly, only one of them is gonna blow up because they're gonna put a +1/+1 counter and then check immediately, do you have 3 or more counters on you? And then, if yes, blow up. Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice is probably ideally searching for 2 Ordeals because the other enchantments I showed you, the really good one, Unbridled Growth, this can't actually enchant Light Pause in Emperor's Voice. Emperor's Voice has a little bit of a gatherer note saying that you have to search for an aura that can attach to Light Pause. Otherwise, that aura just doesn't even change zones. So you ideally you cast a 2 or 3 mana enchantment aura, and then on any target, it doesn't have to target Light Pause, and then Light Pause will trigger, get you an Ordeal. Then you attack with the Light Pause. Eventually, the Ordeal is going to sack itself. Ideally, you have Mazzy already on the battlefield. Then you're going to cast the Ordeal again, searching for another Ordeal, and then the Ordeals blow themselves up. And then you basically search for every 2 mana aura that can actually attach to Light Pause or less. So that's how that works. Again, we have a little bit more card draw again with Caves of Chaos Adventurer. This is actually one of my favorite initiative cards. It works well with aggressive decks, and we are definitely an aggressive deck. Nessian Wanderer is a constellation card. It's going to get us basic lands, I think. No, actually, it just gets us regular lands, but it only puts them into our hand. Seasoned Dungeoneer is going to trigger the initiative and then also explore. So we're going to basically hopefully just draw lands. We don't actually really care about that other stuff. Next, we have SRAM. It's kind of like a poor man's Enchantress Presence. It's only going to trigger off of auras. We don't really have any equipment or vehicle spells, so every time you cast, if you get into an Ordeal loop, SRAM is going to draw you a ton of cards. Escape to the Wilds is just a mandatory requirement for any Gruul deck, basically. It's a 5 mana draw 5, and it's going to refund you 1 mana because you're going to play an untapped land. If you don't really need that mana, just play a tap land. Ignite the Future is a 4 mana draw 3. We play this over Harmonize because ideally you actually explore, put Ignite the Future into your graveyard, and then you just immediately flashback it because paying 4 mana to draw 3 or pseudo draw 3 is not actually that great, but the flashback kind of pushes it over the edge for me. Next, we have a ton of enchantment-based ramp. Again, we're an enchantment-based deck. 2 of these are auras. Ideally, we enchant the same land. In my opinion, you just go all in on the same land, and then that land is going to tap for a ton of mana, and then whenever you untap that land using some sort of creature that untaps lands, then you're going to basically double that land's mana output. Font of Fertility is just a poor man's Wayfarer's Bauble, but it does work with our enchantment-based deck. Next, we have Market Festival and Overgrowth. They basically do the same thing as all of these aura enchant lands, except for the first one that draws you cards. These basically force that land to tap for more mana. Again, you kind of have to feel out your opponents. Are they going to blow up your lands? Do they have some way to do that? If that's the case, you might want to spread it out a little. Otherwise, just put it all into one land. The downside is if they blow up that land, all your auras will go to the graveyard. If you have Mazzy out, they will then be exiled, and then you just start it all over again and enchant some other land. Shiny Impetus is kind of our goad theme. It's going to goad ideally our opponent's creatures, but you don't have to. You could just enchant your own creature, and then whenever that creature attacks, you will get the treasure token, and then you will also give it +2/+0 and trample, assuming you have Mazzy on the battlefield. If that creature ever just YOLO dies, then Shiny Impetus will go into the graveyard, and then you'll have another turn to cast it. Again, we have some more enchantment-based land ramp. So Weirding Wood and Wild Growth, both of these will tap for additional mana. Weirding Wood is a little bit different though because it gives the land itself the ability to add 2 mana of any one color to your mana pool. So it's not going to stack with any other card that is like that. I think that might be the only aura land that does that. So it's going to stack with all of your aura lands. If you somehow steal your opponent's aura lands, then it's not going to stack. Arbor Elf is one of the few ways we're going to untap our lands. Because it only untaps forests, all of our aura lands should ideally be shoved onto forests. Feynorn Elves is basically an Arbor Elf, except it doesn't untap, so it's strictly worse. Goblin Anarchomancer is a pretty powerful way of discounting almost all of our spells. We have very few mono white cards. It's going to discount every other spell though. Next, we have Jukai Naturalist, a white card that can't be discounted anyways, and it has the ability Lifelink, which is actually very relevant since we're partially a Bogle deck. We don't actually have that many ways to grant Lifelink, and then it's going to discount all of our enchantments by 1. Llanowar Elves, basically a Findorn Elf, and then Sakura Tribe Elder, a classic way of getting lands onto the battlefield. Next, we have Voyaging Cedar, a sneaky way of untapping lands. He's over there. Basically required, I think, in all decks that actually bother to run enchantment aura lands. Exploit the Underdark, a great way of getting not only 2 gates, but it will also get you the initiative. And since we're a Bogle deck, we're going to kind of hopefully incentivize our opponents to be goaded so they can never attack us, and we're going to keep the initiative forever. That's kind of the dream scenario. Explore Rampant Growth, basically do the same thing with Explore, actually refunding you 1 mana, assuming you play a untapped land. Detention Vortex is a very, very niche card. You've never seen this tech before, but it's going to enchant a non-land permanent, and then that enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. Notably, though, enchant non-land permanent, it means that if the permanent it's enchanting suddenly becomes a land, the Detention Vortex is going to fall off. The likelihood of that happening is pretty rare unless they play that green creature that turns all of your creatures into lands. And then it has the ability pay 3 mana, destroy Detention Vortex. Only your opponents may activate this ability, and only as a sorcery. So ideally, your opponents waste a bunch of mana to throw this off, and then Mazzy will exile it so that you could detention something else. It's kind of just a 1 mana way to tax your opponents for 3 mana. Ethereal Armor is going to give the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has First Strike. So First Strike is actually surprisingly relevant because Mazzy is going to give +2/+0 on whenever you attack one of your opponents. And then obviously we have a ton of enchantments in our deck. Flamespeakers Will is the scuffed way of destroying artifacts. And because of Mazzy, the downside of sacrificing it is sort of mitigated. Heliod's Punishment, another Detention Vortex kind of style ability. It's going to put 4 task counters on of itself. And then the enchanted creature will have to tap itself to remove the task counters, and then it'll eventually destroy itself. There's no way to get around the destroy effect. Just use Mazzy to recast it if you want to. Invigorating Heart Springs is a 3 mana enchantment based way to gain haste. All of your modified creatures, they don't have to have +1/+1 counters. They can have auras and or equipment. We don't actually have any equipment, so it's probably just auras and +1/+1 counters. Actually, any counter, but we only put +1/+1 counters on our creatures. And then it also starts with 4 counters on it so that you can spread around in case you don't have any auras. Canvas Transformation is a pretty amazing way of removing your opponent's commanders. This is the ideal way. And then I know it sucks that you're going to get hit, attacked for 3 every turn, but it's better than letting your opponents have your commander or their commander. And then speaking of getting attacked by a 3/3, you can use Martial Impetus to goad it, but if you're goading it, your opponents will eventually block it. So that might not work out very well, but if the Oko's transformation, Kenri's transformation falls off eventually, you can use Mazzy to be casted ideally, depending on how early you cast it. Mortal Obstinacy is basically the same thing as the red spell, except for enchantments. And then Spirit Mantle is a great way of giving the enchanted creature protection from creatures, so basically unblockable. Next, we have Bending of Dominaria. This is just a way to get back all of our stuff in case it's still in the graveyard somehow. It's pretty unlikely because Mazzy is going to exile all of our auras, but hey, what can you do? Trace of Abundance is a 2 mana Fertile Ground. It's strictly worse in our deck than Fertile Ground because it's going to give the Enchanted Land Shroud. And giving a Land Shroud actually means we can't do any untapped shenanigans, but it is protected from any land destruction shenanigans our opponents do. Next, we have Vow of Duty. This is a permanent way to stop your opponent's creatures from attacking you. You remember, you could also just enchant your own creatures, just in case you don't really care. Next, we have Aki Battle Squad. Aki Battle Squad is pretty amazing in our deck because, again, our creature is going to be modified with auras, and then it's going to give us a double attack. Aki Battle Squad is very underrated for how much it costs. It's a very powerful effect to get 2 attack triggers. Next, we have Archons Grace. This is a way to generate a ton of Pegasus. It itself has lifelink. Again, lifelink is pretty strong, and then it gives the Pegasus lifelinks. They don't actually have lifelink inherently. Bothersome Kusat. Go to creatures your opponent's control can't block, so feel free to attack through them. It itself has Menace. It's a 3 mana 3/2, and then it has whenever you cast a non-creature spell, which again is actually half our deck because half our deck is just auras. Go target creature your opponent controls. Next, we have Chishio the Shattered Blade. We are heavily leaning in the modification theme of this deck, by the way. So whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 red spirit creature token with Menace. So we're going to generate a lot of creature tokens, assuming we're doing the Ordeal loop or any other loop. And then at the beginning of your end step, you're going to put a counter on each modified creature you control. So Mazzy is almost guaranteed to be modified, so Mazzy is going to slowly grow. Death Kiss is another way we're going to incentivize our opponents to attack each other, or incentivize them to attack us. Who knows? Whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks one of your opponents, double its power until end of turn. So it's not actually going to double our own creatures, but it's going to double our opponent's creatures, and then it has Monstrosity X, and it's going to goad X target creatures your opponent's control. Since we're a green-based deck, we're actually going to have a ton of mana, so there's actually a very high likelihood we can goad a ton of creatures. Next, we have Atali. Atali is just a good stuff deck. We basically are required to play him in every red deck that's on a budget. Kaima, the Fractured Calm, is a very effective way of goading our opponent's creatures if we don't have like this very specific goad spells. And then the vows actually work. The way the vows work with Kaima is that it says it can't attack you, and the Kaima says it must attack if able. Can't beats can, so don't worry if it's in a 1v1 scenario. That creature will never be able to attack you. Geode Rager is another very efficient way of goading our opponent's creatures. And Spook Spirit's Aid, it's pretty sketch, but it's the only card that works with Kaima. And I honestly can't imagine another deck playing Smoke Spirit's Aid other than Kaima deck or a heavy Aura deck that's trying to goad people. Keep in mind, actually, I think when the enchanted creature dies, it deals 1 damage to its control and you create a treasure token. Doesn't matter if you're enchanting your opponent's stuff, you're always going to get the treasure. Kit Kanto, Mayhem Tiva. This is a pretty efficient way of goading our opponent's creatures. And then again, they gain trample. A pretty excessive amount of trample that we're granting our opponents. Vengeful Ancestor has the ability whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, goad target creatures. So we're going to be, again, it's kind of a all-in-one goad creature. And then whenever a goaded creature attacks, it deals 1 damage to its controller, which might come up. Amaria Shepherd is a 7-mana 4/4 flying. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, you may return non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If that land is a plains, you may return that non-land permanent card to the battlefield instead. So keep in mind, you actually want to search up a bunch of non-plains cards. You want to keep your deck chock full of plains, so eventually when you draw Shepherd, you're going to tutor up those plains aggressively. So ideally, I would recommend you search for Forest and Mountain. Forest because of Arbor Elf, and Mountain because it's not plains. Reclamation Slay is just a cheap, efficient way of getting rid of our opponent's artifacts and enchantments, and it's also a target for all of our enchantment stuff. Next, we have Winds of Wrath. This is pretty one-sided, although I say one-sided, we are actually enchanting our opponent's creatures, so keep in mind, if you enchant your opponent's creatures, they're probably not going to die to this spell. Next, we have Nitron. This does three things. Deal 3 damage to target creature. That's a terrible mode. You should probably never do it. Return target card from graveyard to its owner's hand. Pretty niche spell. Actually, the third ability is the #1 spell use mode is actually tap all creatures target player controls. So ideally, you do this in beginning of combat. On your opponent's turn, you tap them all down. Then your turn, you surprise attack them. Or you do it on your turn so you can surprise attack through. Next, we have our only equipment spell, but we can't actually equip our own creatures. This Bloodthirsty Blade is a 2-mana artifact equipment, and very efficient equip cost. It's only 1, and it's going to give the equipped creature +2/+0 and goad. Next, we get into our gates. These gates are just here because of that 1 initiative card that tutors them out. So ideally, you search for Gruul Guild Gate and probably the Boros one. I'm not sure. Just fix your mana, basically. Next, we have 2 bounce land, Gruul Turf and Selesnya Sanctuary. Ideally, we're only playing, I think we're only playing these 2 because we are primarily a green deck. Next, we have our 2 3-color lands. Don't worry about Path of Ancestry's extra text. It's probably never going to come up because Mazzy has a very unique creature type line. Next, we have our Temple lands. Temple lands are very powerful in the sense that they scry away lands. So ideally, you just use that for that. Evolving Wilds, a pretty good combo with Amaria Shepherd. Otherwise, these are just very standard, very basic lands. Mazzy is pretty powerful, and make sure you play her correctly. Thanks for watching.